Abandoned dreams, a life never chosen. In the wild heart of New Mexico, two wounded souls collide, a woman who buried all hope and a native hunter with ancient secrets. As their connection deepens under vast desert skies, an unexpected bond forms through silent glances and unspoken desires. But when an ancestral threat emerges from the earth, everything they've built hangs in the balance. If you love stories of redemption where love defies all boundaries, hit that like button. Subscribe for more captivating tales and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your journey into this emotional wilderness begins now. The desert morning crept across Clara Hartwell's bedroom floor like an unwelcome guest. She watched the light's slow, persistent crawl, how it illuminated the cracks in the plaster, the dust motes suspended in the air, the emptiness. 5 years in this rented adobe house on the outskirts of Santa Fe, and still it felt as impermanent as everything else. 34 years old, Clara had mastered the art of living without leaving a trace. Her fingers traced the outline of her body beneath a thin cotton sheet, pausing at the hollows and curves. Sometimes she wondered if she might dissolve entirely, become one with the sand, the sky, and the wind, faceless, nameless, free. The thought didn't frighten her as much as it should. Outside, the wind carried whispers of another scorching day. Summer in New Mexico showed no mercy, but it lies. Her eyes had grown accustomed to mercies withheld. She expected nothing, hoped for less. The universe had taught her that lesson well. She rose, bones protesting, and shuffled to the small bathroom with its perpetually dripping faucet. The mirror revealed what she already knew. Shadows beneath eyes the color of rain, skin pale despite the unrelenting sun. Hair like autumn wheat tied carelessly at her nape. She leaned closer, searching for traces of the woman she once thought she might become. A concert pianist, perhaps a mother, a wife, someone who mattered. The sound of her landlady's ancient truck coughing to life severed the morning silence. Miriam, 83 and ferocious, had more vitality in her arthritic pinky than Clara had in her entire body. The old woman believed in magic and signs. In the messages carried by hawks and coyotes, she believed in things Clara had long since abandoned. Miriam had said just yesterday, pressing a smooth stone into Clara's palm, "Your spirit is too quiet. The ancestors cannot hear you." The stone now sat on her windowsill, black as midnight, with a single vein of white quartz running through its center like a lightning strike. A divided heart, a life interrupted. Clara dressed mechanically. Faded jeans, white button-down shirt, boots worn thin at the heels, and prepared for another day of cataloging artifacts at the museum. She worked at a historical museum cataloging nameless objects from forgotten lives, meticulously labeled and stored away. She understood them better than she understood the living. She paused at the door, her hand hovering over the stone. Without knowing why, she slipped it into her pocket before stepping out into the merciless light of another empty day. The museum resided in an old Spanish colonial building with thick walls that kept the summer heat at bay. Inside, time moved differently, slower, more deliberate. Clara preferred it this way. The past made sense to her. It was finished, immutable, unlike the future which loomed before her like a vast uncharted desert. Today's task, cataloging a new collection of Native American artifacts donated by a recently deceased collector. Clara moved through the items methodically, pottery shards, arrowheads, woven baskets, assigning each a number, a description, a place in history. Her fingers lingered on a small clay figure of a wolf, its features smooth from years of handling. Something about its silent vigilance resonated within her. "Beautiful, isn't it?" A voice startled her. She hadn't heard anyone enter the storage room. Clara turned to find her boss, Wyatt Cole, standing in the doorway with a man she didn't recognize. "This is Kael," Wyatt said. "He's a cultural consultant from the Apache Nation. He'll be helping us authenticate some of these pieces." The man who stepped forward filled the room in a way that had nothing to do with his physical presence. Though he was tall a head above Clara's 5'6" frame, it was something else entirely that made the air around him seem charged. He moved with quiet confidence, as if perfectly at ease within his skin. His face, angular and weathered by sun and wind, revealed little, but his eyes, dark as obsidian, seemed to absorb everything. "Ms. Hartwell," he said, extending a hand. His palm against hers felt warm, calloused. A hand that knew work, a hand that belonged to the earth. Clara withdrew quickly, uncomfortable with the sudden awareness of her own body. Some of these artifacts appeared to be from restricted ceremonial contexts. Kael said, his attention shifting to the collection. "They should never have been removed from our lands." "That's precisely why we've asked for your expertise," Wyatt replied. "We want to ensure everything is handled with proper respect, repatriated, if necessary," Wyatt Cole said. Kael nodded, his expression softening just a bit. Clara watched him as he moved among the artifacts, his fingers hovering above them, never quite touching, as though he was reading the air around them. She could almost hear their stories in the stillness. Clara found herself staring at the strong line of his jaw, the way his black hair was clipped short at the sides, but left longer on top, catching the dim light from above. When he reached the wolf figure she had been examining, he paused. "Mai," he murmured, the coyote trickster transformer, his eyes locked with hers. "Sometimes destroyer." There was something in his gaze that made Clara feel seen, truly seen for the first time in years. The sensation rattled her, left her unsettled. She quickly looked away, focusing on her catalog sheets, but she could still feel the weight of his gaze, like heat pressing against her skin. Later, alone in the storage room, Clara realized that her hand had been in her pocket, gripping Miriam's stone so tightly that its edges had left marks on her palm. For 3 days, Clara worked alongside Kael, keeping her distance. She spoke only when necessary, answering his questions about provenance and acquisition with cool professionalism, yet every move he made seemed to draw her attention. The deliberate way he handled each artifact, the soft words he whispered in Apache, the scent of sage and cedar that seemed to linger on his clothes. On the 4th day, he came in with a thermos of coffee and an extra cup. Without a word, he poured the rich, dark liquid and placed it beside her workstation. The unexpected gesture took her off guard. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her fingers around the warm cup. "You arrive early, always before sunrise." Kael observed, his voice low and steady. It wasn't a question. Clara sipped the coffee, its strength laced with cinnamon. "I like the quiet," she said, her voice quieter. "The Apache believe dawn is sacred. When the first man and woman emerged into this world, they were greeted by the eastern light." His voice carried no expectation of response, simply sharing the story as easily as he'd shared the coffee. They worked in silence for an hour. Gradually, the space between them became less strained, more comfortable. Kael spoke again, the question catching her off guard. "The stone in your pocket. You touch it when you're thinking. May I see it?" Clara hesitated, then slowly withdrew Miriam's gift. She placed it on the table between them, suddenly aware of how self-conscious she felt. Kael studied the stone without touching it. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "My landlady gave it to me," Clara replied. She paused, embarrassed by Miriam's mysticism. "She said my spirit is too quiet, that the ancestors cannot hear me." A small smile, one she hadn't seen before, softened Kael's features. "Your landlady is wise." He pointed to the white vein running through the black stone. "This is a harmony stone. In our way, it represents the path between worlds, the visible and the invisible, the living and the spirits." Clara found herself drawn into his gaze. "Do you believe in such things?" Kael took a long moment to consider her, his eyes never leaving hers. "I believe there are currents beneath the surface of life. Most people never feel them." His voice dropped lower. "Others, are drowning in them. The truth of his words struck her deep like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of understanding spread throughout her body. How had he seen so clearly what she had so carefully hidden? "I need to check something in the archives," Clara said abruptly, standing and moving toward the door. In the quiet of the document room, Clara pressed her forehead against the cool metal shelf and breathed deeply. Something was shifting, a disruption to the numbness she had so carefully crafted. The stone felt heavier in her pocket. "Your ancestors cannot hear you," Miriam's words echoed in her mind. "Perhaps I never wanted them to. Have dinner with me." The invitation caught Clara off guard at the end of their second week working together. She looked up from the pottery shard she was photographing, certain she had misheard. "Pardon, dinner." Kael repeated, his expression unreadable. "There's a place outside town. Good food. Better view." He added, a small, teasing smile tugging at his lips. A dozen refusals rose to Clara's lips, practiced perfect, but what came out was, "Why?" Kael raised an eyebrow. "Because people eat. Together, sometimes." His voice softened, a touch of humor there. "Sometimes it helps." "Helps what?" "To remember we're not alone." The simplicity of his answer disarmed her. She set down her camera, suddenly aware of how long it had been since she'd shared a meal with anyone who wasn't Miriam or a colleague at the museum. "I don't think just food," he said. "No expectations." Later, as twilight painted the desert in shades of amber and rose, Clara found herself following Kael's truck along a dirt road that wound into the foothills. They parked beside a modest adobe structure, smoke rising from its chimney. A hand-painted sign above the door read simply, "Almas." Inside the restaurant was small, only 5 tables each, adorned with a tiny vase of wildflowers. An elderly woman emerged from the kitchen, her face lighting up as soon as she saw Kael. "Yate Shiaj." She greeted him warmly, pulling him into a tight embrace. She then turned her curious gaze on Clara. "This is my Aunt Alma," Kael introduced. "Aunt, this is Clara. She's helping with the museum project." Alma's knowing smile suggested she didn't quite believe this was just a professional dinner, but she led them to a table by the window. "The usual?" she asked Kael, who nodded in agreement. Once seated, Clara gazed out at the landscape spread before them. Rugged mountains stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, with vast stretches of scrubland, scattered with juniper and piñon pine. In the distance, the haunting cry of a coyote broke the evening silence. "Your aunt's restaurant is beautiful," Clara said, trying to steer the conversation to neutral ground. "It was my mother's before hers," Kael responded. His eyes clouded with something Clara couldn't quite read. Before she could say anything more, the Navajo phrase for death hung between them like a heavy cloud. Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the reflex to pull away from anything that felt too close. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "It was many years ago." Kael studied her, his gaze unwavering. "You understand loss," he said, his tone more statement than question. "Everyone does," Clara replied quickly. "Not the same way. Some losses change our shape forever." And before she could continue, Alma returned with 2 plates of fragrant stew, fresh bread, and a pot of tea. The food was simple yet extraordinary. Tender lamb, green chilies, and herbs Clara couldn't identify. They ate in silence for a while, the flavors unlocking something deep inside Clara that had been closed off for too long. "Why did you come to New Mexico?" Kael asked, breaking the silence. Clara considered deflecting but found herself answering truthfully. "I needed somewhere far from what I knew, somewhere I could disappear." "From what?" he asked. "Expectations. Memories." Clara hesitated. "Myself, maybe." Kael nodded as if that made perfect sense. "And have you disappeared?" The question hung in the air, heavy as the stone in her pocket. Clara stared out at the darkening landscape, watching the stars multiply as each minute passed. I thought I had, she said finally. After they finished eating, Kael led her outside to a small clearing where a fire pit had been set up. He carefully arranged the wood and lit it. They sat on simple wooden benches as the flames flickered upward toward the star-filled sky. In our way, Kael spoke, his voice blending with the crackling fire, we don't believe people can truly disappear. The earth remembers our footsteps. The wind carries our breath. The fire holds our stories. Clara watched the flames dance, feeling something ancient stir deep within her. What if your story isn't worth telling? She asked quietly. Kael's eyes caught the firelight when they met hers. Every story matters, even the ones we try to forget. That night, as Clara drove back to her empty house, she felt the walls she had so carefully built beginning to crack. The stone in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth. The ancestors cannot hear you, Miriam's voice echoed in her mind. Perhaps for the first time in years, Clara wanted them to. Rain came to the desert that weekend, transforming the dry earth into a vibrant landscape. Clara stood on her small porch, watching the water stream from the roof, carrying dust and debris away in miniature rivers. The air smelled of wet sage and possibility. With trembling fingers, she reached for the wooden chest she kept beneath her bed. It was the only thing she had brought with her from her past. 5 years, and she had never opened it once. Inside lay the remnants of the life she had fled. Photographs, letters, a dried corsage, a small velvet box containing an engagement ring never worn, and beneath these, wrapped in faded blue silk, the reason for her self-imposed exile. The sonogram picture was creased at the corners, barely visible, that tiny comma of possibility gone before she had fully comprehended its existence. The hemorrhaging afterward, the emergency surgery, the doctor's gentle voice explaining there would be no more chances. No more maybes. Zeke had tried to be kind, to pretend it didn't matter. We have each other, he had said, holding her hand in the sterile hospital room. But she had seen the truth in his eyes, the flicker of relief beneath the sympathy. He had never wanted children, had agreed to try only because she had wanted it so desperately. 3 months later, she found the text messages on his phone. His affair had been going on for nearly a year. I can't do this anymore, he had said when confronted. You're like a ghost now. I don't know how to reach you. Perhaps he had been right. Perhaps she had already begun to disappear. Now, with rain drumming on the roof, Clara traced the ghostly image with her fingertip. I'm sorry, she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was apologizing to. The child who never was, the woman she had been, or the woman she had become. A knock at the door startled Clara. She quickly shoved everything back into the chest, sliding it under the bed before answering. Kael stood on her porch, rain dripping from his jacket. Your landlady said you might need help. The arroyo behind your house sometimes floods in heavy rain. Clara glanced past him to see Miriam watching from her own porch, making no attempt to hide her matchmaking. The old woman raised her coffee cup in cheerful salute. I'm fine, Clara said automatically. Then, seeing the genuine concern in Kael's eyes, she added, but thank you for checking. Kael nodded, turning to leave. Then he paused. Something in her expression must have betrayed the emotional excavation she'd been through. Are you sure you're all right? The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. For a moment she considered inviting him in, considering unburdening herself to this man who seemed to see through her carefully built walls. Instead, she gripped the doorframe tighter. Just memories, she managed to say. Kael studied her face. Memories are like desert seeds, he said finally. They wait beneath the surface, dormant, until the rain comes. Then they bloom all at once. The unexpected poetry of his words caught her off guard. Is that an Apache saying? Clara asked, her smile touching his lips. No, he said with a faint smile. Just an observation. The rain intensified, flowing between them as the world outside seemed to wash clean. You should come in until it passes, Clara heard herself say. Inside the small house felt unexpectedly intimate. The shabby furnishings, the bare walls, all now exposed to new eyes. Kael stood quietly taking in the space, the bookshelf filled with archaeological texts, the ancient upright piano in the corner, gathering dust, the conspicuous absence of personal photographs or mementos. You play? He asked, nodding toward the piano. Not anymore. Clara busied herself making tea, keeping her back to him. Why? The directness of his question still caught her off guard. Most people respected the boundaries she had carefully set up, never pressing too deeply. Some things we leave behind, she replied finally, echoing his habit of speaking in gentle aphorisms. He accepted the steaming mug she offered his fingers, brushing hers for a brief moment. That slight contact sent an electric current through her. How long had it been since anyone had touched her with such intention? The rain will pass, Kael said, moving to the window, but it changes what it touches. They stood side by side, watching the water transform the desert. Something was shifting between them, invisible lines being crossed, redrawn, erased. Why did you really come here today? Clara surprised herself with her boldness. Kael turned to her, his dark eyes serious. Because some people disappear so completely that only those who know how to look for signs can find them again. The truth of his words settled in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. For the first time in years, Clara felt truly seen. No longer the careful facade she presented to the world, but the hidden, wounded self beneath. And if they don't want to be found, she whispered. Kael's answer was so quiet, she almost didn't hear it above the rain. Then I will wait until they do. The museum's back room had become their shared space, a neutral ground where artifacts and histories connected them. As June melted into July, Clara found herself arriving earlier each morning, anticipating the moment Kael would appear with his thermos of cinnamon-spiced coffee and quiet greeting. Today, however, he had something else. A small leather pouch worn smooth with age. I need your help, he said, carefully untying the pouch's drawstring. These belong to my grandfather. From the pouch he withdrew a collection of small carved stones, mostly animals, each no larger than a chestnut, a deer with delicate antlers, a bear standing upright, an eagle with its wings drawn in. Clara resisted the urge to touch them, recognizing their personal significance. They're beautiful, she said. They're storytellers, Kael replied, arranging the figures in a semicircle on the table. My grandfather was a medicine man. He used these to teach the old ways. His fingers hovered over the eagle. But there's one missing. A mountain lion, he continued. It was his power animal, his protector. Understanding dawned on Clara. You think it might be in this collection? Kael nodded. The collector who donated these artifacts lived near my grandfather's land. Many things disappeared when our people weren't looking. The implication hung heavily between them, centuries of appropriation. Sacred items treated as curiosities. Clara suddenly felt complicit in her role as caretaker of objects that should never have left their homes. I'll help you look, she promised. They worked through the collection, taking their time with each small carving and polished stone. By noon, Kael's phone rang. After a brief conversation in Apache, he turned to Clara, regret shadowing his eyes. I must go. My uncle needs help with his sheep. A broken fence line, he said. Clara nodded, hiding the disappointment she felt. I'll continue looking. Thank you. Kael hesitated, then added, Would you like to see where these belong? Where my grandfather lived? I could take you tomorrow. It's my day off. The invitation felt heavy, full of unspoken meaning. Clara knew she stood at a crossroads. One path led back to the safety of isolation, the other to something unknown and potentially dangerous. Yes, she said, surprising herself. I'd like that. The next morning dawned clear and hot. Kael picked her up in his weathered truck, a hand-woven blanket spread across the back seat, a cooler tucked behind the driver's seat. They drove northwest from Santa Fe, the landscape shifting from high desert to red rock country. As they traveled, Kael pointed out landmarks, a mesa shaped like a sleeping warrior, a group of cottonwoods, marking an underground spring, and a distant rock formation he called Shiprock. He spoke of growing up between two worlds, school years in Albuquerque with his mother, and summers spent with his grandfather on the heart of the reservation. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "The city made me forget things my grandfather thought I should remember. The reservation made me remember things the city said I should forget." "Which world felt more like home?" Clara asked. Kael considered this as he maneuvered over a rough stretch of road. "Neither. Both. I learned to carry home inside me." After 3 hours of driving, they turned onto a dirt track that wound through juniper-covered hills. Eventually, they stopped before a small hogan, a traditional Apache dwelling nestled at the base of a red sandstone cliff. A stream glittered in the distance, its path marked by green cottonwoods winding through the dry landscape. "My grandfather built this with his own hands," Kael said as they exited the truck. "When he walked on, I couldn't bear to leave it empty. I come when I can." The hogan was simple but beautiful, a round structure with a smoke hole at the center of its roof, the door facing east to greet the morning sun. Inside, the scent of cedar and earth filled the air, and a small wood stove sat in the center. Bedrolls and blankets were arranged along the walls. Shelves held books, pottery, and tools. Everything had purpose. Nothing was superfluous. "It's peaceful," Clara said, feeling the weight of the outside world fall away. They spent the afternoon exploring the surrounding land. Kael pointed out medicinal plants, shared stories about the rock formations, and showed her the small garden he kept near the stream. For lunch, they ate blue corn tortillas, dried meat, and wild berries from the cooler sitting in the shade of an ancient cottonwood. As the sun began its westward journey, Kael led her to the base of the cliff. There, protected by an overhang, were paintings on the stone handprints, spirals, and animal figures. "How old are these?" Clara asked, her professional interest momentarily overpowering the connection she felt to the day. "Some are ancestral. Pueblo perhaps 1,000 years old," Kael replied, placing his hand near a faded mountain lion figure. "My grandfather added to the story, as did his grandfather before him." "Is that allowed?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. The museum cataloger in her was horrified at the thought of modifying ancient art. Kael's smile held no judgment. "This is living history, not a museum piece. The story continues." He traced the outline of the mountain lion with his finger without touching it. "This is what's missing from my grandfather's carvings, his protector." As the sun sank lower, they sat side by side at the cliff base, watching the play of light and shadow across the landscape. Clara felt a strange sensation, as if the boundaries of herself were dissolving, connecting her to the land, the moment, and the man beside her. "Why did you invite me here?" she asked finally. Kael was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was soft with honesty. "Because you look at broken things and see their value. Because you handle the past with respect." He turned to face her. "Because your eyes hold a sorrow that matches my own." The space between them seemed to collapse. Clara felt herself leaning forward, drawn by an invisible force. Kael's hand rose slowly, hesitantly, to touch her cheek. The gentleness of his touch brought tears to her eyes. "I don't know how to do this anymore," she whispered. "Do what?" he asked, his thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. "Connect. Feel. Be present." Kael's gaze softened. "You're doing it now." As twilight settled around them, Kael built a small fire near the hogan. They sat wrapped in blankets, watching the flames flicker against the darkening sky of the desert. For the first time in years, Clara felt no need to retreat, to protect herself, to hide. Instead, she found herself talking about Zeke the baby. that never was, and the emptiness that had driven her to New Mexico. Kael listened without interrupting. His steady presence anchored her as the painful words escaped into the cool evening air. When she finally fell silent, he added a small branch to the fire. "My wife died 8 years ago." He said, his voice steady, but the grief still evident in his eyes, as the firelight danced across his face. "Cancer. We'd been married 3 years. No children." He poked at the embers, his gaze distant. "Her name was Lisa. Sometimes I still reach for her in this night," he murmured. The simplicity of his words, the rawness of the pain he still carried, comforted Clara more than any cliché could have. Here was someone who understood that some wounds never fully heal. "They just become part of who you are," Clara said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Does it get easier?" Kael met her eyes, his expression unreadable. "Not easier," he said. "The pain becomes less sharp, more like an old friend who visits sometimes. You'll learn to make room for it without letting it consume everything." That night they slept in separate bedrolls inside the hogan. The dying embers of the fire cast soft shadows on the walls. Clara lay awake for hours listening to the rhythm of Kael's breathing, feeling something long dormant inside her begin to stir. Something dangerously like hope. 3 days later, the mountain lion carving appeared, nestled among a collection of trade beads. Clara recognized it immediately, the same flowing lines, the same polished stone as the carvings Kael's grandfather had made. She held it in her palm, tracing its smooth contours, the delicate detailing of the animal's powerful haunches and alert ears. When Kael arrived that morning, she held it out to him wordlessly. He sucked in a sharp breath as he took it from her. His fingers ran over the carving reverently, tracing its shape. "Where did you find it?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Box 14. Clara replied, her voice trembling slightly. "With the beads from the Four Corners region." She hesitated. "It's accessioned now, part of the permanent collection." Kael's expression darkened as the weight of the situation sank in. The museum protocol meant the carving couldn't just be removed, even if it had been wrongfully acquired. The process of deaccessioning and repatriation was complex, bureaucratic, and often took years. "I'll speak with Wyatt Cole," Clara offered. "Explain its significance." Kael nodded, still cradling the carving in his hands. "Thank you." After a brief silence, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in red cloth. "I brought you something." Inside the cloth was a pendant, a small piece of turquoise wrapped in silver wire hanging from a simple leather cord. The stone's blue-green surface was streaked with thin lines of darker matrix, creating a pattern that resembled flowing water. "I made it," Kael said, suddenly seeming uncertain, "from a stone I found near my grandfather's hogan where we sat." Clara carefully lifted the pendant. "It's beautiful." "In our way, turquoise is living stone," Kael said softly. "It absorbs and reflects the energy of its wearer." His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "It protects. It strengthens." The significance of the gift wasn't lost on Clara. This wasn't just a trinket. It was an offering, a connection, a silent acknowledgement of something growing between them. With trembling fingers, Clara tied the cord around her neck, feeling the cool stone settle against her skin. "Thank you," she whispered. Later, Wyatt Cole called an emergency meeting. The museum's main benefactor had pulled out their funding, citing financial difficulties. "Staff cuts will be necessary," Wyatt said, looking at Kael with regret. "The repatriation project deemed non-essential will be the first casualty." "I'm sorry, Mr. Stroud," Wyatt muttered, unable to meet Kael's eyes. "We'll have to terminate your consultancy at the end of the month." Clara felt the news like a physical blow. 3 weeks. That was all the time they had left to work together, to finish the catalog, to see where this fragile connection between them might go. Later in the parking lot, Clara found Kael leaning against his truck, staring toward the setting sun. She approached him hesitantly, unsure of his mood. "I'm sorry about the project," she said. "The project was always temporary," Kael replied, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "But some things aren't meant to end when the work does." The turquoise pendant seemed to warm against Clara's skin. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice soft. Kael met her eyes. "With the mountain lion carving, I'll file the paperwork for repatriation. Start the process." Kael's hand reached out his fingers lightly, brushing the pendant at Clara's throat. Some journeys take longer than others. The touch, brief as it was, sent a jolt of electricity through her body. Clara felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by an invisible pull. This time, when Kael's hand cupped her cheek, she didn't pull away. His lips, when they met hers, were gentle questioning, a beginning, not a demand. When they pulled apart, Clara kept her eyes closed, savoring the warmth of the connection, the sensation of being truly present, of returning. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her forehead resting against his. "Do what, Ken?" Kael's voice was soft, steady. "Trust. Hope. Risk losing again." Kael's thumb traced the line of her jaw, a small but intimate gesture. "We've both already lost." "That's not the question," he said, his dark eyes holding hers with a weight that pressed into her chest. "The question is whether we're brave enough to begin again." As twilight deepened around them, Clara felt something shift inside her, a seed long buried, finally breaking through the hard-packed earth and reaching toward the light. The next morning, Miriam was waiting on Clara's porch. Her face, aged with time, was creased with concern. "Mijita," she said slowly, rising from the wooden chair. "You have visitors." Clara followed Miriam's gaze to the unfamiliar car parked in her driveway, a sleek silver sedan with rental plates. A sudden tightness gripped Clara's stomach. "Who?" she began, but the question was answered before it could finish. A tall, fair-haired man stepped out of the passenger side. "Lizzie." The name caught Clara off guard, as though it belonged to someone else, a ghost from another life. The nickname felt like an invasion, as if someone had picked the lock she'd carefully sealed away. "James." His name tasted strange on her tongue. "What are you doing here?" she asked. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, a touch of gray at his temples. But his smile was the same charming, slightly crooked, with a hint of boyishness that once made her heart race. "Can we talk?" Inside, Miriam gave Clara's arm a gentle squeeze before retreating back to her house, but not before giving James a suspicious once-over. Clara led him into her small living room, thankful she'd tidied up the night before. "Nice place," James said, though the tone of his voice suggested otherwise. His eyes roamed over the sparse furnishings, the bare walls. "Cozy." "Why are you here?" Clara repeated, standing firm as James sank onto her couch uninvited. "Your mother's been worried sick," he began, his voice carrying a note of frustration. 5 years of bare minimum contact, Lizzie. Christmas cards with no return address. Really?" The mention of her mother sent a sharp pang of guilt through Clara's chest. "Mom knows I'm alive," she said, her voice cold. "That's enough." "Is it?" James leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "She's not well, Liz. Heart problems. The doctors say. Don't use my mother to manipulate me." Clara interrupted, her voice sharp. James winced, then sighed, running a hand through his hair. It was a familiar gesture, one that once would have softened her. "Sorry. That came out wrong." He paused, his voice heavy with regret. "Look, I'm not here just for your mom. I'm here for you, too. We, your family, your friends, me." His eyes locked onto hers. "You disappeared, Liz. After everything, you just vanished. No explanations, no goodbyes. Just gone." The unfairness of his accusations stung, and Clara's voice tightened as she responded. You were the one who ended things, James. Or have you conveniently forgotten about the affair? I made a mistake. James stood, moving closer to her. A terrible mistake. Losing you made me realize what really matters. Clara stepped back, maintaining the distance. It's been 5 years. I know, he said, his expression pained. I've tried to move on, dated other women. Nothing feels right. Nothing feels like us. There is no us anymore, Clara said flatly. There could be. He replied, his voice soft. Come home, Lizzie. Your job at the university is still open. They never found anyone with your expertise. Your mother needs you. Your friends miss you. He reached for her hand, but she quickly withdrew. You're married, Clara said, her gaze locked onto the wedding band on his finger, which he had clearly forgotten to remove when stepping out of the car. James glanced down at his ring, surprised to see it still there. It's complicated, he murmured. Kate and I, it's not working out. A bitter laugh escaped Clara. So I'm what? The backup plan again. No, God, no. Zeke ran both hands through his hair, frustration clear on his face. I'm making a mess of this. When your mother told me she was ill, that she hadn't seen you in years, I thought maybe I could help. Bring you home. This is my home now, Clara said, her voice calm but firm. Zeke gestured around the small room, the words laced with disdain. A rented house in the middle of nowhere, a dead-end job at some tiny museum. This is what you've settled for. His dismissal of her life, simple as it was, ignited something deep in Clara's chest. 5 years ago, his words would have shattered her. But now they merely clarified what she already knew. She was no longer the woman who had loved this man. I think you should go, she said quietly, her tone unshaken. Lizzie, please. Now, James. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded sharply. I'll be at the La Fonda Hotel until Sunday. Think about what I said. About your mother, if nothing else. After he left, Clara sank onto the sofa, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The familiar panic rose in her chest, the tightening, the shortness of breath, the walls closing in on her. Her fingers found the turquoise pendant at her throat, its smooth surface cool against her heated skin. Outside, a vehicle pulled into her driveway. Through the window, she saw Kael's truck. For a moment, she considered not answering his knock, retreating into the protective shell she had so carefully built over the years. But something, perhaps the stone against her skin, perhaps the memory of his lips on hers, gave her courage. When she opened the door, Kael's smile faded, as concern replaced it. What's happened? An old ghost, Clara said, stepping aside to let him in. As they sat at her small kitchen table, Clara told him about Zeke, their history, and his unexpected appearance. Kael listened without interruption. His steady presence was a calming force, a stark contrast to the chaos Zeke had stirred within her. He wants you to go back, Kael said when she finished. Not a question, but a statement. Clara nodded. He says my mother is ill. And is she? Probably. She's nearly 70, always had a weak heart. Guilt twisted inside Clara. I should have visited. Called more often. Been a better daughter. Kael's hand covered hers on this table. The past is a shadow we cannot change, but the present that we can choose. What if I've been hiding here, running away instead of facing my life? Have you? Kael asked, his eyes searching hers, demanding honesty. Clara touched the turquoise pendant at her throat, feeling its warmth. At first, yes. I came here to disappear, to stop feeling. Her eyes met his across the table. But lately I've been remembering how to be present, how to see beauty again, how to breathe without pain. Kael's fingers tightened around hers, then perhaps it's not about going back or staying away. Perhaps it's about moving forward, wherever that leads you. The wisdom in his words settled in Clara's chest. Moving forward, not retreating, not hiding, but stepping into whatever came next. "Will you come with me?" she asked suddenly. "To see my mother, just for a weekend." Surprise flickered across Kael's face, quickly replaced by something deeper. "Are you sure?" "No," Clara admitted with a small laugh. "I'm terrified." But she turned her hand beneath his, their palms meeting, fingers intertwining. "I think it's time to stop being afraid." That night, alone in her bed, Clara held Miriam's black stone in one hand, Kael's turquoise pendant in the other. Two paths, two possibilities. The past and the future held simultaneously in her open palms. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine what might be instead of what had been. Outside, a coyote's call pierced the night, a wild, mournful sound that spoke of solitude and journeys not yet begun. The Boston airport hummed with activity, a cacophony of announcements, rolling suitcases, and hurried conversations. Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest as they navigated the crowded terminal, the same anxiety that had plagued her during the flight. Beside her, Kael moved with quiet confidence, unfazed by the chaos. "You're doing fine," he murmured, his hand a steady presence at the small of her back. 2 weeks had passed since Zeke's unexpected visit. 2 weeks of planning. Her phone calls to her mother were filled with tears on both ends, doubts and reassurances exchanged like fragile promises. Now standing at the threshold of her former life, Clara wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The rental car felt cramped. The highway felt too crowded. The lush greenery of the Massachusetts countryside seemed almost oppressive after years spent in the wide-open spaces of the desert. As they neared her hometown, a small, picturesque college community where her mother still lived in the house Clara had grown up in, she found herself gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "We can still turn around," Kael said, his voice gentle. "Go back to New Mexico." Clara shook her head. "No, I need to do this." Her mother's house appeared smaller than she remembered, a modest colonial with blue shutters and a wraparound porch. Flower beds meticulously maintained, despite her mother's supposed illness, lined the walkway. As they pulled into the driveway, the front door opened. Margaret Stroud stood framed in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth. At 68, she still carried herself with an elegance that belied her age. Her silver hair was cut in a stylish bob, and her posture remained erect, despite the cane she leaned upon. When Clara emerged from the car, her mother moved forward with surprising speed. "Elizabeth," she breathed, pulling Clara into an embrace that smelled of gardenia, perfume, and home. "My girl, my beautiful girl." For a moment, Clara stood stiffly in her mother's arms. Then slowly she relaxed into the embrace, allowing herself to feel the connection she had, severed 5 years earlier. When they finally separated, both women's cheeks were wet with tears. "You must be Kael," Margaret said, turning to the man who waited patiently beside the car. "Thank you for bringing my daughter home." Kael smiled, accepting her outstretched hand. "The journey was hers to make. I just accompanied her." Inside the house, everything was exactly as Clara remembered. Family photographs lined the mantel, her father's books filled the study walls, and the grandfather clock in the hallway still chimed the quarter hour. Yet as Clara moved through these familiar spaces, she felt like a stranger, hyper-aware of how much she had changed, how she no longer fit within these walls. "Your room is ready," Margaret said, leading them upstairs. "I've put Kael in the guest room down the hall." The separate accommodations were a gentle reminder of her mother's generational sensibilities. Clara exchanged a small smile with Kael over her mother's head. Her childhood bedroom had been preserved like a museum exhibit, trophies from piano competitions, still lined the bookshelf, framed sheet music decorated the walls, and photographs from her college graduation ceremony stood on the bedside table. The sight of her younger self smiling, confident, full of plans for a future that would never materialize, made Clara's throat tighten. "I'll leave you to settle in," her mother said, squeezing her arm. "Dinner at 7. Alone in the room, Clara sat heavily on the bed, running her hand over the familiar quilt. Being here felt like slipping into old clothes that no longer fit, recognizable but constraining. She moved to the window that overlooked the backyard, where an ancient oak tree still dominated the landscape. How many times had she sat beneath that tree, dreaming of the life she would lead? A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Kael entered his tall frame, feeling out of place against the backdrop of her teenage sanctuary. "Your mother is formidable," he said, sitting beside her on the bed. "Terrifying, you mean?" Clara attempted a smile. "She's already planning to show you my baby pictures after dinner." "I look forward to it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, shoulders touching a small island of familiarity in this sea of memory. "Being here," Clara began, then faltered. "It's like walking through someone else's life. I recognize everything, but nothing recognizes me." Kael's hand found hers, his touch warm. "The past is always there, waiting, but we decide how much power it has over us." The dinner that evening was a careful dance, polite yet laced with probing questions. May Stroud's curiosity about Kael, his background, his work, and his intentions toward her daughter was barely concealed behind the perfect manners of a seasoned hostess. For his part, Kael answered with calm honesty, neither apologizing for his Apache heritage nor romanticizing it. "And what are your plans?" May finally asked, turning her gaze to both of them. Clara tensed. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. They hadn't discussed what would happen once Kael's consultancy ended. 3 days remained before his contract expired, before their professional connection was severed. "I've applied for a position with the Tribal Cultural Preservation Office," Kael said, his voice steady. "It's based in Santa Fe." The revelation surprised Clara. He hadn't mentioned applying for any jobs. "And you, Clara?" May's gaze sharpened. "Zeke mentioned your position at the university is still available." Clara set her fork down. "I haven't decided yet, Mom. My life is in New Mexico now." A life or a hiding place? The bluntness of May's question made Clara flinch. Her mother had never been one to shy away from uncomfortable truths. "Both, maybe," Clara admitted after a pause. At first it was definitely the latter. But now she met Kael's eyes across the table. "Now I'm not so sure." Later that evening, after May had retired, Clara and Kael sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies light up the summer night. The air felt different, so much more humid and thick compared to the dry desert nights. "You never mentioned applying for a job in Santa Fe," Clara said, her voice breaking the comfortable silence. Kael's shoulder brushed against hers as they gently rocked back and forth. "I wasn't sure if it mattered." "Of course it matters." "Natum." "Does it?" His tone remained neutral, but his words held weight. "You haven't said what you want, Clara, whether there's a place for me in your future." The directness of his words caught her off guard. In the weeks since their first kiss, they had lived in a state of careful ambiguity, connected but undefined, intimate, yet uncommitted. Clara had been content to let the current carry them, afraid to name what was growing between them, lest it dissolve upon examination. "I don't know what I want," she admitted, finally breaking the silence. "Everything feels uncertain, in flux." "Not everything," Kael replied, his eyes intense as they locked with hers in the porch light. "What I feel for you, that is certain. Whether you stay in New Mexico or return to Boston, whether you let me into your life or choose to walk alone, my feelings won't change." The simple declaration hung in the cool night air. Clara felt tears prick behind her eyes, overwhelmed by the gift of his honesty, his patience, his unwavering presence. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "Of what?" He asked, his voice low. "Of trusting, of hoping, of building something new only to watch it crumble." Her fingers found the turquoise pendant at her throat. "Of losing you the way I've lost everything else that mattered." Kael's hand cupped her cheek, his touch achingly gentle. "Loss is part of life, Clara. We cannot avoid it, but we can choose whether to let the fear of it keep us from living." As his lips met hers, Clara felt something inside her finally surrender. Not to him, but to herself, to the possibility that perhaps after all the brokenness and disappointment, something beautiful could still grow from the ruins of her former life. The next morning, a text message from Zeke appeared on her phone. "Coffee, just to talk. The cafe on Main, 10 a.m. Clara stared at the screen, conflicted. Part of her wanted to ignore it to protect the fragile peace she had found. But another part of her, the part that had started to believe in her own strength again, knew that true healing meant facing the past, not just running from it. "I should go," she told Kael over breakfast. "For closure, if nothing else." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Would you like me to come with you?" "No." Clara smiled, grateful for the offer, but certain of her answer. "This is something I need to do alone." The cafe hadn't changed. The same checkered tablecloths, the same chalkboard menu, the same hiss of the espresso machine. Zeke was already there when Clara arrived, 2 cups steaming in front of him. "You remembered?" she said, sliding into the chair across from him. "1 latte, extra shot, no sugar. Some things you don't forget." He studied her face. "You look good, Liz. Different, but good." "I am different," Clara said, taking a sip of her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "Why did you really come to New Mexico, Zeke? The truth this time." He looked down, his face flushing with a hint of embarrassment. "Your mother really is concerned about you." Kael said, his voice quiet but sincere. He sighed, turning his cup between his hands. "But yes, I had my own reasons. My marriage is ending. Has ended, really. The papers are being filed next month." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" Kael's eyes searched Clara's. "Yes," she said, her voice softening, and she realized. Not because she still loved him, but because she understood the ache of dreams unraveling. What happened? The usual grew apart, wanted different things. Kael shrugged, but the gesture couldn't hide the hurt underneath. "She wanted children. I didn't. Until I did. And then it was too late." The irony wasn't lost on Clara, the cruel circular patterns of life bringing them both back to the same painful crossroads from opposite directions. "So you thought you'd find me, and what pick up where we left off?" "Honestly, yes." Kael reached across the table, but stopped just short of touching her hand. "Is that so crazy? We were good together once." Once. Clara wrapped her fingers around her cup, drawing warmth from the ceramic. "But that was another life, Kael. Another me. And this new you." His voice softened, the question catching her off guard. "Is she happy? Was she happy?" Clara thought about it. Not in the simple, uncomplicated way she had been before loss had reshaped her. But something deeper had started to take root in the desert soil of her new life. Something more substantial than happiness. Purpose, perhaps, or peace. "I'm becoming whole again," she said quietly. "In my own way, on my own terms." Kael nodded slowly, resignation settling into his features. "And the Apache guy, is he part of that? His name is Kael." Clara felt a surge of protectiveness. "And yes, he's part of it. An important part." "I figured." Kael managed a small smile. "I saw how you looked at him. You never looked at me that way, even in the good times." They talked for another hour about mutual friends, her mother's health, and the years that had passed between them. When they finally parted outside the cafe, Kael pulled her into a brief embrace. "Be happy, Lizzie," he murmured against her hair. "Whatever that looks like for you." Walking back to her mother's house, Clara felt lighter than she had in years. The past hadn't disappeared. It never would, but its power over her had diminished. The ghost of what might have been no longer haunted her steps. Kael and her mother were in the garden when she returned, an unlikely pair tending to late summer roses. The sight of them together, her past and her potential future in quiet conversation, filled Clara with unexpected joy. "Everything okay?" Kael asked when she joined them. Clara slipped her hand into his, feeling the rough calluses of his palm against her skin. "Yes." She said it, meaning it for perhaps the first time in years. "Everything is okay." They returned to New Mexico 3 days later. The journey back somehow felt easier than the departure had been. Something had shifted during their time in Boston, a closing of one chapter, the tentative opening of another. Clara's goodbye to her mother had been tearful but peaceful, with promises of regular calls and a Christmas visit. "Bring him with you," Margaret had whispered during their final embrace. "He's good for you." The desert welcomed them with a spectacular sunset, bands of crimson and gold stretching across the horizon. As they drove from the Albuquerque airport toward Santa Fe, Clara felt the familiar landscape recalibrating something inside her, as if her internal compass had been spinning and finally it had found true north again. "Home," she murmured, more to herself than to Kael. He glanced at her, a smile touching his lips. "Yes." The next morning brought unwelcome news. Wyatt Cole was waiting when they arrived at the museum, his face grave. During their absence, a pipe had burst in the storage area, flooding the room where the Native American artifacts were kept. Most of the items had been salvaged, but several, including the mountain lion carving, had been damaged. The artifacts had been damaged. "I'm so sorry," Wyatt Cole said, leading them to a makeshift conservation area where waterlogged items were being carefully dried. "We've called in specialists from the university, but some pieces may be beyond saving." The mountain lion carving lay on a tray. Its once smooth surface was now discolored, a thin crack running along its spine. Kael lifted it gently, his face unreadable. "May I take this?" he asked quietly. "To try and restore it myself." Wyatt hesitated, his mind caught between protocol and compassion. "Technically, it's still museum property until the repatriation process is complete." "Please," Clara interjected. "It's of immense cultural significance. Kael is the most qualified person to handle it properly." After a moment's consideration, Wyatt nodded. "All right, but I'll need you to sign for it. Document its condition and promise to return it if the repatriation claim is denied." Later, in the privacy of Kael's truck, he examined the carving more closely. "This is bad," he said, his finger tracing the crack. "The water has weakened the stone from within. It could break completely if not treated properly." "Can it be saved?" Clara asked, her voice soft with concern. Kael carefully rewrapped the carving in soft cloth. "Perhaps, but not by modern methods. This requires the old ways." That evening, they sat on Clara's porch, the damaged carving resting between them on a small table. The night was unusually still, with the typical evening breeze absent, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. "In our tradition," Kael explained, "objects like this aren't just representations. They embody the spirit of what they depict. When they're damaged, that spirit is wounded." "And how is such a wound healed?" Clara asked. "Through ceremony, prayer, connection to the forces that shaped the stone in the first place." Kael looked up at the star-filled sky. "I need to take this to a medicine man. My grandfather's brother still lives on the reservation. He would know what to do." "When will you go?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow." Kael's eyes met hers across the small table. Will you come with me? The invitation felt significant more than just a trip. It felt like an initiation into a part of his life few outsiders were ever permitted to witness. Clara touched the turquoise pendant at her throat, feeling its reassuring weight. Yes, she said, her voice steady. I'd be honored. And they set out before dawn, driving northwest as they had before, but continuing past Kael's grandfather's hogan into more remote territory. The landscape grew increasingly stark and dramatic, towering mesas, deep canyons, and vast stretches of red earth beneath an endless blue sky. My uncle lives alone, Kael explained as they navigated a particularly rough section of dirt road. He chose the old ways. No electricity, no running water. He is one of the few remaining traditional healers who knows the mountain lion ceremonies. By midday, they reached a small dwelling tucked against a sandstone cliff. Unlike Kael's grandfather's round hogan, this structure was more traditional, a simple earthen dwelling, with a smoke hole nearly invisible against the desert landscape. A weathered pickup truck held together by rust and sheer willpower sat nearby. An elderly man emerged as they approached, tall and lean despite his years. His white hair was pulled back in a traditional bun, and his face was deeply lined from decades under the desert sun. He greeted Kael in Apache, his voice strong and melodious. Kael introduced Clara, explaining her role in finding the carving. The old man, Jeb Stroud, studied her with penetrating eyes, before nodding once, seemingly satisfied with what he saw. Inside the dwelling, it was simple but comfortable wool rugs. On the packed earth floor, neatly arranged cooking utensils and bundles of herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Jeb examined the damaged carving in silence, turning it in his gnarled hands, occasionally muttering under his breath. It's worse than you said, he finally pronounced in English, presumably for Clara's benefit. The spirit is not merely wounded. It is withdrawing. Soon the connection will be broken entirely. Can it be healed? Kael asked, his voice steady but filled with urgency. The old man set the carving down on a small table. Perhaps, he said, but it will require a night's ceremony and preparation. His sharp eyes turned to Clara. The Bilagana woman. Does she understand what this means? Kael glanced at Clara, his gaze steady. She respects our ways, uncle. She has helped bring the carving home. John considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. Then she may observe but not participate. Some pathways are not open to outsiders. The remainder of the day was spent in preparation. John instructed Kael on gathering certain plants, preparing special pigments, and arranging a ceremonial space outside the dwelling. Clara helped where permitted, but remained at a respectful distance, observing when asked. She watched the relationship between the uncle and nephew, the easy exchange of knowledge, the shared understanding of traditions that stretch back countless generations. As twilight approached, John beckoned Clara to sit beside him, while Kael continued his preparations. You carry a wound also, the old man said without preamble, his accent thickening his words. Old pain, deep inside. Clara's hand instinctively moved to her abdomen, the place where life had briefly flickered before being extinguished. Yes, this is why the stone chose you. John gestured toward the turquoise pendant at her throat. It recognized what needed healing. The stone chose me, Clara asked her rational mind, struggling to grasp the concept. Yet somehow it resonated on a deeper level. John smiled, his weathered face softening. Of course. In our way, we do not choose objects of power. They choose us. My nephew understands this. It is why he gave you the stone, but did not place it around your neck himself. He waited for you to accept it. The revelation shifted something inside Clara. Her understanding of Kael, of the gift he had given her, of the connection growing between them. This wasn't just attraction or compatibility, but something far deeper. It was a recognition of shared wounds, a mutual potential for healing. As the darkness of night fell, a fire was built in a small clearing in front of the dwelling. John arranged various items around it: bundles of herbs, small bowls of pigment feathers, polished stones. The damaged mountain lion carving was placed at the center of the arrangement on a woven blanket. "Now we begin," John said, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality. "You will sit there." He pointed to a spot several feet from the ceremonial area. "Watch if you wish. Close your eyes if the spirits move you, but do not approach until we have finished." What followed was unlike anything Clara had ever witnessed. John began to sing a haunting melody that seemed to rise and fall like the contours of the surrounding landscape. Kael joined in, at certain points their voices blending in perfect harmony. Herbs were burned there, sweet smoke curling toward the starry sky. Pigments were carefully applied to the damaged carving with small brushes made of yucca fiber. As the ceremony progressed, Clara felt herself slipping into an altered state of consciousness. The fire's flames seemed to take on shapes: animals, human figures, abstract patterns that spoke a language she couldn't understand but somehow felt. The night air pulsed with energy, as if the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds had thinned. Through it all, the steady voices of the two men anchored Clara to reality, while simultaneously inviting her to step beyond it. Hours passed. The fire burned down to embers. The singing gradually subsided, replaced by a profound silence that seemed to hold all the voices that had come before. Clara realized with surprise that she had been crying. She couldn't remember when the tears had started or why they had come. "It is done," John said, finally, his voice rough from the exertion. Kael rose from his position by the fire and came to where Clara sat, offering his hand to help her stand. Her legs were stiff from sitting so long, and her mind still half in the dreamlike state the ceremony had induced. "Are you all right?" Kael asked softly. "Yes." And she was, though all right, felt too simple a word for the surge of emotions coursing through her. It was as if something deep within had shifted, some weight had been lifted. "Did it work? Is the carving healed?" Clara whispered. "Come see," Kael replied. Together, they approached the ceremonial space. The mountain lion carving lay on its woven blanket, illuminated by the dying glow of the fire. The discoloration was gone. The stone had returned to its original warm hue, but most remarkably, the crack that had run along its spine was gone, completely healed. "How?" Clara whispered, bending closer to inspect it. "Not how," John corrected, joining them. "Why?" He nodded toward Kael. "The spirit chose to remain because it recognized its family." Kael nodded solemnly. As dawn's first light began to break, they prepared to leave. The carving, now whole again, was carefully wrapped and placed in Kael's pouch, alongside his grandfather's other animal figures. John embraced his nephew, murmuring something in Apache that made Kael nod in acknowledgement. To Clara's surprise, the old man then turned to her. "The mountain lion teaches us to honor our territories, to know what is ours, to protect and defend." His gnarled hand brushed the turquoise pendant at Clara's throat. "Find your territory, daughter of another people. Claim it, defend it, whether it be a place, a purpose, or a person." The words sank into her chest like stones dropping into still water, ripples of meaning expanding outward. As they drove away, Clara found herself looking back at the solitary figure standing before his dwelling, hand raised in farewell against the lightning-lit sky. "Will we see him again?" she asked. Kael's expression was thoughtful as he navigated the rough track. "Perhaps, if the spirits determine our paths should cross again." He fell into an uncomfortable silence, the events of the night settling around them like a shared blanket. Eventually, Clara spoke the question that had been forming in her mind since the ceremony began. "What your uncle said about the stone choosing me, about wounds, recognizing each other. Do you believe that?" Kael glanced at her, then back at the road. "I believe that healing doesn't always come in the forms we expect. Sometimes it arrives as a person, a place, a moment of connection." His hand found hers across the console. Sometimes the most broken things recognize each other best. As the sun rose fully above the horizon, painting the desert in gold and amber, Clara felt something inside her rise as well. Not the naive hope of her youth, but something deeper, something more substantial. A quiet certainty that whatever came next, she would face it standing in her own truth, no longer hiding from life, but stepping deliberately into its flow. The ancestral threat had not been some external force, she realized, but the danger of disconnection from heritage, from meaning, from one's own heart. And the healing had already begun, not just for the carved stone, but for the woman who had helped bring it home. The end came quickly. 1 week after their return from Jeb Stroud's home, Wyatt Cole called Clara into his office. The museum's financial situation had worsened. "More cuts are necessary," he said, his voice grim. "Your position is being eliminated effective in 30 days. "I'm sorry, Clara," Wyatt said, genuine regret in his voice. "Your work has been exemplary. I've already drafted recommendation letters for you. The Field Museum in Chicago has an opening. The Met in New York is expanding their Southwest collection. Both would be lucky to have you." The news should have devastated Clara. Another loss, another ending, another forced beginning. Yet as she sat in her small house that evening, turning possibilities over in her mind, Clara felt strangely calm. 5 years ago, losing her job would have seemed catastrophic. Now it felt like an invitation. To what, she wasn't yet sure. Kael's consultancy had ended 3 days earlier. The repatriation paperwork for the mountain lion carving had been filed, though the process would likely take months. He had been offered a position with a tribal cultural preservation office, a job that would keep him in Santa Fe, but require frequent travel to the reservation. They hadn't discussed what this meant for them. The unspoken question hung between them, like a bird uncertain where to land. Miriam found Clara sitting on her porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. The old woman settled into the chair beside her with a soft grunt, her ancient bones protesting the movement. "So," Miriam said without preamble, "you are leaving us." Clara turned to her in surprise. "How did you know about my job?" Miriam waved a dismissive hand. "Not the job, Hija, the journey. It's in your eyes." She studied Clara's face with penetrating wisdom. 5 years, I've watched you like a seed, waiting for water for the right season to grow." A smile creased Miriam's weathered face. "Now the rains have come." "I don't know what I'm going to do," Clara admitted. "Where I'll go." The old woman nodded as though this confirmed something. "Then you must listen." She tapped her gnarled finger against Clara's chest. "Not here," she said, moving her finger to Clara's forehead. "And not here." Then her hand spread wide over Clara's abdomen. "But here where life begins, where knowing lives before thinking gives its shape." The words struck Clara deeply. How long had she lived in her head, analyzing every possibility, weighing every risk against the potential loss? How long had she kept her heart guarded, afraid of its vulnerability? Maybe Miriam was right. Maybe it was time to listen to something deeper, something older. That night, Clara dreamed of the piano. In the dream, she sat before the keyboard dust motes, dancing in the sunlight around her hands. The keys beneath her fingers felt both foreign and achingly familiar. When she began to play, the music poured from her like water wild, untamed. It wasn't the precise performances she had once perfected, but something freer, more elemental. Notes became rivers, harmonies like mountain ranges, rhythms like the pulse of the earth itself. She woke with tears on her cheeks, the certainty in her bones undeniable. The next morning, Clara called her mother. "I need you to do something for me," she said after exchanging greetings. "In the attic there's a box labeled Elizabeth Compositions. Could you send it to me? Your old music." May Stroud sounded surprised. "Of course, but why now?" "Because I think I'm finally ready to hear it again." 3 days later, a package arrived. Inside was a medium-sized box filled with notebooks of her college compositions, pieces she had written during that brief, shining period when she believed in her own voice before doubt and practicality led her toward the safety of museum work. Clara spent the evening at her neglected piano. Her fingers stumbled at first, then began to remember the paths across the keys. The music wasn't technically perfect, but it was raw and emotional compositions that spoke of a young woman's hopes, fears, joys, and sorrows. A young woman she had almost forgotten she was. When Kael arrived the next morning, he found her still at the piano, surrounded by scattered sheets of notation paper. New compositions born in the night hours. "You never told me you were a composer," he said, leaning against the doorframe. Clara looked up, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm not. I was. Once. In college. Play something for me." She hesitated, then turned back to the keyboard. The piece that emerged was one she had written just hours before, an eerie melody that seemed to capture the vast skies and ancient rocks of New Mexico, the silence of dawn, the whisper of wind through juniper. When she finished, the final notes hung in the air, between them, soft and lingering. "That's beautiful," Kael said quietly. "What's it called?" Clara stared at her hands, still resting on the keys. "I think, Finding Home." Kael moved to sit beside her on the piano bench, close enough that Clara could feel the warmth of his side against hers. "The Tribal Cultural Center is expanding," Kael said. "They're developing educational programs about Apache music, traditional and contemporary. They need someone with formal music training to help document, transcribe, teach." Clara turned to him, understanding dawning. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a possibility," Kael said, his dark eyes holding hers. "A way to combine what you were with what you've become, if you want it." The invitation hung between them, not just for a job, but for a future, a shared path. "What if I fail?" The question came from the deep place of doubt that had silenced her music years ago. Kael's hand covered hers on the piano keys. "What if you fly?" That afternoon they drove to his grandfather's hogan. The small house stood, as it always had, simple and enduring, at peace with its surroundings. Inside, Kael placed the pouch containing the animal carvings on a small shelf. "They belong here," he said, "watching over this place until we return." The word we hummed between them like a plucked string. Clara moved to the doorway, looking out at the landscape, red rocks, green juniper, blue sky. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. "I want to try," Clara said, finally turning back to Kael. "The job us all of it." Kael crossed to where she stood, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. "Are you sure it won't be easy? Two cultures, two ways of seeing the world. There will be those who don't understand." "I'm not sure," Clara admitted. "But I don't have anything except that I'm tired of making choices based on fear. Tired of hiding from life instead of living it." Her hands rose to frame his face. "I want to be brave again." His kiss was different this time, not questioning or tentative, but certain. Acclaiming a promise, a beginning. When they parted, Clara felt something settle into place inside her, like a key turning in a lock long rusted from disuse. That night they slept beneath the stars, a single blanket spread on the earth outside the hogan. Above them, the Milky Way stretched like a river of light across the velvet darkness. Beside her, Kael's breathing deepened into sleep. His arm was a comforting weight around her waist. Clara stayed awake, watching the slow turn of stars above, feeling the solid earth beneath her. For the first time in years, she felt fully present. Not hiding from the past, not anxious about the future, but completely immersed in the moment. The turquoise pendant at her throat seemed to pulse with a gentle warmth. "The ancestors cannot hear you," Miriam had said. But perhaps Clara thought they could now. "I'm here," she whispered to the star-filled sky. "I'm listening." Autumn came to New Mexico in subtle shifts. Cooler mornings, the cottonwoods along the riverbeds turning gold, and the quality of light changing from the harsh glare of summer to something softer, more honeyed. 3 months had passed since Clara had accepted the position at the Tribal Cultural Center. 3 months of learning, of adapting, of building something new from the pieces of her past. The work challenged her in ways her museum job never had. She spent her days recording elders, singing traditional songs, creating a notation system that honored a musical tradition never meant to be written down, teaching young Apache students how to bridge the worlds of traditional and classical music. Evenings were often spent in composition. Her music, once silent for years, flowed again, now influenced by the rhythms and tonalities of Apache songs. Not everyone welcomed her presence. Some tribal members viewed her with suspicion, another white academic appropriating their culture, no matter how well-intentioned. Taza's Aunt Alma accepted her readily enough, but others in his family remained distant, watchful. "Give them time," Taza advised when Clara expressed her frustration. "Trust is earned slowly here, especially from those who remember what was taken." They divided their time between Clara's house in Santa Fe and the Hogan, gradually bringing her belongings to the small dwelling, books, clothes, her digital piano. The transition was gradual, organic, neither of them feeling the need to formalize what was happening. They were building a life together, day by day, choice by choice. In late September, a letter arrived from the museum. The repatriation claim for the mountain lion carving had been approved. The figure would be officially returned to the Apache Nation in a ceremony the following month. "Will your uncle come?" Clara asked as they prepared dinner that evening. Taza shook his head. "He rarely leaves his home these days, but he'll send a prayer with us." The ceremony was small, but significant. Museum officials, tribal representatives, and local media. Wyatt Cole made a brief speech about cultural reconciliation and the importance of returning ceremonial items to their rightful stewards. A tribal elder accepted the carving with formal dignity, speaking in Apache about the restoration of harmony and the healing of old wounds. Afterward, as people mingled over coffee and fry bread, Zeke approached. Clara had known he would be there. He'd emailed a week earlier explaining he'd be in Santa Fe for a conference and asking if they could meet. "You look well," he said, his eyes taking in her appearance, the turquoise pendant at her throat, the subtle changes in how she carried herself. "Happy I am," Clara replied, glancing across the room at Taza, who was engaged in conversation with several tribal elders. "Better than I expected, actually." Zeke smiled, and for the first time in their long acquaintance, his expression seemed genuine rather than charming. "The divorce was finalized last month. I'm teaching a course at Berkeley this semester, thinking about making the move permanent." "California suits you," Clara remarked. "I think it might." He hesitated, then added, "I'm seeing someone, a colleague in the anthropology department. It's early days, but it's good." "I'm glad," Clara said, surprised by how sincere she sounded. Whatever bitterness had lingered after their relationship had ended in New Mexico had washed away with the desert rains worn smooth by new beginnings. "Your mother showed me some of your new compositions when I visited her last month," Zeke said. "Extraordinary stuff. You found your voice again." The compliment warmed Clara more than she expected. "I had help remembering it was there." Zeke's eyes drifted to Taza, understanding in his gaze. "He's good for you. Anyone can see that." He touched her arm briefly. "I should go. My flight leaves in a few hours." As he turned to leave, Clara called after him. "Zeke." "Thank you." Shimda, he looked back, an eyebrow raised in question. "For coming to New Mexico last spring, for making me face the past instead of hiding from it." A smile touched his lips. "We all need a push sometimes." Later that evening, alone with Taza in her Santa Fe house, Clara found herself drawn to the wooden chest beneath her bed. She hadn't opened it since that rainy day months ago when she had confronted the relics of her former life. "What is it?" Taza asked, watching as she placed the chest on the bed between them. Clara Hartwell lifted the lid of the wooden chest, her fingers tracing the familiar edge. Inside there were old photographs, letters, a dried corsage, and a small velvet box containing the engagement ring she had never worn. These were things she had carried with her for so long without truly looking at them. Kael gave a silent nod, his gaze understanding. It was time to decide what to keep and what to let go. Clara picked up the sonogram picture, carefully unwrapping the silk cloth that had protected it. She allowed herself to really look at the image, for the first time the small, fragile comma of life that never became a child. "This happened," she whispered, but it no longer defined her. Placing the picture back in the chest, she reached for the velvet box. The diamond ring caught the light, its cold brilliance almost too much to bear. "I should have returned this years ago," she thought. "It never felt like mine, even when I wore it." One by one, Clara sifted through the items, placing those she wanted to keep in one pile, things to return in another, and those to release in the final one. It felt almost like a ceremony, marking a transition from one life to another. When she was finished, the pile of things she wished to keep was small, just a few photographs of her parents. A letter from her piano professor that had once inspired her, a pressed wildflower from her childhood home. Everything else she would let go. "The ring goes to Zeke," Clara said, her voice steady. "The other things, maybe it's time to set them free." Kael's hand covered hers. "How?" The question hung between them for a moment, and then Clara knew. The next morning, they drove to the Hogan. The autumn light painted the world in gold, turning the ordinary rocks and scrub into something magical. At the base of the cliff, where ancient paintings were sheltered by overhanging rock, they built a small fire. One by one, Clara placed the items into the flames. The corsage, old letters and photographs, memories of a life that no longer belonged to her, were consumed by the fire. Not in anger, but in recognition that some things were meant to be transformed, not preserved. As the last photograph curled and blackened in the flames, Kael placed a small bundle of sage on the embers. Sweet smoke rose toward the cliff face where generations of hands had left their marks on the stone. "In our way," Kael said softly, "we believe nothing truly ends. Energy changes form, but it continues." He pulled her closer, his arm around her waist. "The past becomes part of the present, which flows into the future." Clara leaned into his embrace, watching the smoke drift upward. "Like music," she said. "Notes that have been played still vibrate in the air, in the memory in the body that heard them." They stood together, watching as the fire burned down to embers and shadows lengthened across the ancient landscape. The wooden chest, now holding only the few items Clara had chosen to keep, sat beside them. It was lighter now, no longer a burden, but a treasure chest filled with selected memories. "What happens now?" Clara asked, not just about the ceremony, but about everything about their shared life, their individual paths, the future that stretched before them. Kael's answer was simple. "We continue the story." As twilight gathered around them, Clara felt a deep sense of completion. Not an ending, but a circle connecting past, present, and future. The turquoise pendant at her throat seemed to pulse with gentle warmth, as though responding to a current flowing through the earth beneath their feet, the air they breathed, the bond between them. "The ancestors can hear me now," she thought, "and at last I can hear them." Winter descended on New Mexico with fierce intensity. Snowstorms swept down from the mountains, transforming the desert into a world of stark contrasts. Black rocks rose from the white drifts like islands in a frozen sea. Juniper branches sagged beneath their icy burden. At night the temperature plunged and the stars burned, with a cold fire in the clear air. The Hogan, with its wood stove and thick walls, became their home as travel between Santa Fe and the reservation grew more difficult. Clara found herself embracing the isolation, the simplicity. Her days followed the rhythm of sunlight and firelight, shaped by the needs of the physical world rather than the constraints of time. She continued her work with the Cultural Center, remotely transcribing recordings, composing educational materials, and coordinating via satellite internet when available. In the evenings, she played her digital piano, composing pieces that reflected her evolving relationship with the harsh yet beautiful land. Kael's work with the Preservation Office intensified as winter deepened. A development company had proposed a resort near sacred sites on the reservation's borders. The tribal council was divided. Some saw economic opportunity, others feared desecration. Kael's days were filled with meetings, research, and diplomatic negotiations between conflicting interests. "It's always the same story," he said one evening, exhaustion evident in the lines of his face. "Progress versus preservation, the future versus the past, as if they must be enemies rather than partners." Clara handed him a mug of tea, settling beside him on the bench outside the hogan. Despite the cold, they often sat there at day's end, watching twilight paint the landscape in washes of pink and purple. "Maybe that's the real work," she suggested, "finding harmony between what was and what could be, honoring both." A smile touched Kael's lips. "You sound like my grandfather." "I'll take that as a compliment." February brought a brief thaw, and the snow retreated into shadowed ravines, streams swelling with meltwater. One morning before dawn, Kael woke Clara. "Come," he said, already dressed for hiking. "There's something I want to show you." They drove to a trailhead Clara had never seen before, and set off on foot. The hills dotted with junipers stretched before them. As the sun rose over the horizon, they crested a rise and paused. Kael's hand found hers. Before them lay a hidden canyon, its walls streaked with layers of red gold and cream-colored sandstone. At the canyon's base, two streams converged, one flowing clear and swift from melting snow, the other rich with minerals, glowing turquoise from underground springs. At their meeting point, the waters swirled together in a dance of colors, before continuing as one river, the place of Earl. Kael spoke softly. "My grandfather brought me here when I was 12. It's sacred ground, not for ceremonies or monuments, but for decisions. For transitions," Clara said, watching the streams merge, the meaning dawning on her. "Why have you brought me here now?" Instead of answering, Kael reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in red cloth. When he unfolded it, Clara's breath caught. Nestled in the cloth was a ring, not diamond but turquoise, set in silver, the same rich blue-green as her pendant. "I made this," Kael said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "from a stone found on this land and silver from my grandfather's collection." He took her hand, his touch warm, despite the cool morning air. "In my culture," he continued, "marriage isn't just between two people. It's between families, clans, and worlds, my world and yours, our pasts and our shared future." The turquoise ring caught the early light, seeming to glow from within. "I'm asking if you'll join your path with mine, Clara, not just for now, but for all the days to come." Tears blurred her vision, not from sadness or even joy, but from recognition. This moment had been coming since that first day in the museum storage room, when she had held the wolf carving and felt his eyes upon her. Maybe even before that, a current set in motion by forces neither of them fully understood. "Yes," she said the word, emerging as both an answer and a beginning. "Our paths are already joined," Kael said, slipping the ring onto her finger and drawing her close. Their kiss held all the promise of the merging streams below. Separate journeys becoming one distinct, yet unified. That evening, back at the hogan, Clara sat at her piano as twilight gathered. The melody that emerged from her fingers was unlike anything she had composed before, weaving together classical structures and native tonalities. She blended the traditions of both worlds into something new yet ancient. Kael listened from across the room, sitting by the wood stove, his eyes closed in appreciation. When the last notes faded, he opened his eyes to find her watching him. "What will you call it?" he asked. Clara looked down at the turquoise ring on her finger, at the matching pendant that never left her throat. Confluence, she said. The place where rivers meet. When later, as they lay together beneath woolen blankets, the glow of the wood stove casting shadows on the hogan's walls, Kael spoke of Apache wedding traditions, the exchange of gifts, the blessing way ceremony, the weaving together of two lives through ritual and commitment. Wheels on both ways, he said, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. Your traditions and mine finding harmony between them. Clara nestled closer, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder, like the streams in the canyon. Yes. Kael's arm tightened around her. Separate sources. One river. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes, descending through the still air, accumulating in silence. Inside, wrapped in warmth and each other, they spoke of plans, possibilities, and the life they would build together, not in spite of their differences, but because of them. As Clara drifted toward sleep, she felt a profound sense of rightness, as if all the detours and disappointments of her life had been necessary. Steps leading her to this man, this place, this moment of joining. Mrs. Herrera had said, "The ancestors cannot hear you," but Clara knew they could now. And what they heard was not the silence of grief or the whisper of hiding, but the clear, strong voice of a woman who had found her way home, not to the place she had begun, but to the place she was meant to be. Spring arrived late to the high desert that year, hesitant and tender after the long winter. When it finally came, it brought transformation. Fields of wildflowers erupted across the landscape. Cottonwoods unfurled lime-green leaves along the watercourses, and birdsong filled the dawn hours. A year had passed since Clara had first held the mountain lion carving in the museum storage room, since she had first felt Kael's eyes upon her. 1 year of endings and beginnings, of letting go and reaching forward, of finding her voice again in more ways than one. Their wedding took place at the confluence, the sacred canyon, where two streams joined to form one river. Guests gathered on a flat expanse of sandstone above the water, Clara's mother and a few close friends from her Boston life. Kael's extended family, some still reserved, but respectful. Miriam resplendent in her finest dress and turquoise jewelry, and even Wyatt Cole representing the bridge between their professional and personal worlds. Jeb Stroud, defying expectations, had made the journey from his remote home to conduct the ceremony, a blend of Navajo blessing way and Western tradition, spoken in both English and Dinebizad. Clara wore a simple white dress adorned with a sash of hand-woven fabric Alma had created for the occasion. Kael wore dark trousers and a white shirt, a silver and turquoise bolo tie at his throat. The vows were exchanged beneath the vast New Mexico sky. Their words carried on the wind that had shaped the land, that had carried seeds across the desert, and whispered through the generations of joy and sorrow. The rings they exchanged, hers, worn for months, his a matching silver band with a smaller turquoise stone, caught the spring sunlight, reflecting it as though hope had taken form. Afterward, the celebration took place at Alma's restaurant table, set beneath cottonwood trees that were just beginning to sprout new leaves. There was food, music, stories, and laughter. The mingling of two worlds, sometimes awkward, sometimes surprising in its harmony. May Stroud, graceful even in her late years, found common ground with Taza's relatives through their shared love of the desert landscape. Miriam entertained Eliza's Boston friends with tales of desert magic which made them laugh, wonder, and perhaps believe a little. Children from the reservation played tag, their movements as smooth and natural as the breeze. As twilight fell, Eliza played on a piano that had been moved to the restaurant just for the occasion. The piece she performed was Confluence, the song that had emerged the night of their engagement, its melodies speaking of separate journeys, obstacles overcome, and the moment when distinct paths merged to form something greater than either alone. When the last notes faded, she looked up to see Kael watching her, his dark eyes reflecting the certainty she felt in her own heart. This was right. This was meant to be. This was home. Later, as stars began to appear in the deepening blue of the desert sky, they slipped away from the celebration. The short drive back to the Hogan was quiet, both wrapped in the significance of the day. They knew one chapter had closed and another had begun. Inside, Kael started a fire in the stove while Eliza lit candles. The simple space had evolved during their months of shared life. Her books now mingled with his. On rough wooden shelves, a colorful rug she had chosen brightened the earth floor, and photographs of both their families shared space on a small table. Not separate lives merged, but a new life was being built together, honoring what had come before, while creating something neither could have imagined alone. "Happy?" Kael asked, joining her on the bed they shared. Clara thought for a moment, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the turquoise pendant that had become a part of her. "Happy seems too small a word," she said finally. "I feel whole, complete. Like I've been walking toward this my entire life, even when I thought I was lost." Kael's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. "In our way," he said softly, "we believe that souls recognize each other across time. Some connections are made before we even come into being. Like the stone that chose me." Clara smiled, remembering Jeb Stroud's words from months ago. "Yes." Kael's thumb traced the outline of her ring, like streams that begin on opposite sides of the mountain, but are destined to join. Outside, the night deepened, stars swirling slowly across the desert sky. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, they talked of their future, of the music program Clara was developing to bring children from the reservation to perform with a Santa Fe orchestra, of Kael's promotion within the Cultural Preservation Office, and the possibility of adopting a child, expanding their family. As sleep claimed them, Clara drifted into dreams with a sense of profound peace. The journey that had brought her to New Mexico, begun in grief and loss, had transformed into something she could never have imagined in those gray days of her earlier life. She hadn't found what she was looking for, but she had found something better, something she needed. The next morning, the sky dawned clear and bright. Clara woke early, slipping out of bed without disturbing Kael. Outside, she stood in the growing light, watching as the first rays of the sun touched the distant mesas, turning them from shadowed silhouettes into vibrant red monuments. From her pocket, she pulled two small objects. Miriam's black stone with its streak of white quartz and a tiny carving Kael's uncle had given her at the wedding ceremony. The carving was a small wolf figure, not unlike the one she had first held in the museum storage room, but this one was made from the same turquoise as her pendant and ring. "To remind you," Jeb Stroud had said, placing it in her palm, "that even the wildest spirit can find its home." Now, as the desert came alive around her, lizards scurrying across sun-heated rocks, birds calling from juniper branches, the scent of sage rising with the warming air, Clara held the two stones in her open palms. One represented her past, her journey through shadow. The other symbolized her present and future, solid as stone, but vibrant with possibility. Footsteps sounded behind her. Kael stepped from the Hogan, tousled from sleep, but smiling when he saw her. "You're up early," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I wanted to see the sunrise." Clara showed him the stones in her palms. "Shadow and stone, where I've been and where I am." Kael's arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her close. "Not just where you've been," he murmured softly. "Where we are. Where we'll go together." Clara closed her fingers around the stones, feeling their weight, their connection to earth and sky, past and future. She slipped them back into her pocket where they rested side by side, separate, but touching, distinct, but unified. Like streams converging, like lives joining, like love itself flowing between shadow and stone, finding its way home. All stories are created for entertainment purposes, and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts, as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original, creative work.